And welcome to the International Schools Market in 2025 and beyond webinar. We are very delighted to be hosting ISC's Research, Sami Yosef, Head of Global Research, to be bringing us our presentation today. ISC Research processes over 200 data points per year, compiling that data into comprehensive range of reports, white papers, and market-specific intelligence reports. So we're very delighted to have you, Sami, and I'll turn it over to you, and we look forward to hearing your presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Joe, and yeah, pleasure to meet everyone. What I'll do, I'll just get my presentation ready, share my screen, and then we can crack on and look at the international schools market in 2025. And yeah, I'd just like to say thanks again for NIASC for the invitation to speak today and for bringing together such a diverse and thoughtful community of educators and school leaders. I mean, seeing the chat there, people coming from all over the world. So very delighted and happy to be here today. So for those of you who have not had the pleasure of meeting before, my name is Sami Yosef, Head of Global Research, and I'm based in Bangkok, Thailand. Been here for just over 12 years now, with a background in admissions and marketing, and then also in data and intelligence. So my job now is to spend an unhealthy amount of time with data so that you don't have to really. What I'll share today goes beyond just the charts and the numbers. It's about what those numbers mean for you as leaders, as educators, and as stewards of school quality and purpose. Because the international schools market is growing at pace, it's evolved continuously, and in many ways is still being defined in real time. So today we'll explore how that evolution is shaping the landscape of accreditation, teaching and learning, and the student experience across different regions. So the hope is that the data sparks some reflection, not only where your schools stand today, but where they could go next. And thanks, Joe, for doing the brief introduction about ISC. We do cover multiple different data points every single year, from enrollment, curricula, tuition fees, staffing, and governance. So in other words, the whole ecosystem. And here's the important bit. In this sector, there's no shortage of opinions. Everyone has a theory about what's driving demand or why families choose international schools, but the evidence tells a much clearer story. And my role, and also ISC researchers' role, is to help you cut through the noise and ground those theories in data and highlight the trends that are genuinely reshaping our sector. So without further ado, let's jump in and see what's happened over the past 10 years. And we kick off with that headline figure of 15,075. So that's how many English medium international schools exist in the world today. It's a number that has more than doubled since the turn of the millennium. And just to caveat that number, this is based on ISC Research's definition of what is an international school. So if anyone wants to question that, we can address that in the Q&A later on. But I'll dive through it and go through these numbers as, they may not mean much on paper, but numbers like stories gain power through context. And, there are now, just as many international schools as there are Burger King restaurants worldwide. And much like Burger King's promise to have it your way, international education is all about choice, personalization, and global flavor in the 21st century. These schools are spanning the shimmering skyscrapers of Singapore to the dusty plains of Nairobi, from hillside compounds in Bogota to converted villas in Ho Chi Minh City. In July 2015, you can see there that 45% growth. It was down at 10,408 English medium international schools, and we've grown to that 15,000 figure today. And while the growth in school numbers tells part of that story, it's the surge in enrollment that adds real depth. Because 10 years ago, around 5 million students attended these schools, and today that figure has risen to 7.7 million. It's a 51% increase, 2.7 million more students being added into these different campuses, each representing a family who made a deliberate decision to invest in this kind of education. And alongside them are more than 730,000 teaching staff. That's up by 54% in the same period. So in human terms, the total number of people connected daily to the sector now exceeds the population of Hong Kong. So the international schools market today feels less like one in recovery and more like one in transition, moving steadily from being perceived as an elite offering to a mainstream educational choice in many parts of the world. So building on these numbers, I'll take you on a guided tour of the market as it stands in 2025. We'll explore the big picture, the finer brushstrokes, looking at the motivations of parents, realities of teacher movement, growing influence of school groups, and the evolving expectations of international school graduates. Because behind every school is a community, behind every data set is a decision, and behind every decision is a human story. So let's look at where the schools are located around the world. And Asia accounts for 58% of international schools worldwide. That's more than 8,700 schools educating around 4.9 million students from early years all the way through to graduation. And this dominance isn't new, but it's become increasingly pronounced over the past decade. And what's particularly fascinating about Asia's market is that it's not concentrated in one corner of the continent. East Asia, Southeast Asia, Western Asia, and Southern Asia all contribute significantly, each shaped by its own growth drivers, cultural nuances, and regulatory realities. And in Western Asia, if you look at each of those, particularly the Gulf states, international schools form a core part of national development strategies. Governments are actively encouraging educational investment, and school development is closely tied to long-term economic vision plans. In Southeast Asia, demand has been driven by a rapidly expanding aspirational middle class, and parents here are seeking globally recognized curricula, be it British, American, or the IB, but increasingly within bilingual models that preserve cultural identity alongside global mobility. And in East Asia, the picture is a little more complex. In China, regulatory tightening has led some international schools to pivot, rebrand, and even integrate elements of the national curriculum. Yet despite these challenges, the appetite for international education remains incredibly strong. And in Southern Asia, the story is one of sheer scale. India and Pakistan in particular are seeing steady school development fueled by population growth and a deepening demand for English medium, globally competitive education. But while Asia continues to dominate just in sheer volume, other regions are quietly building that momentum. From Eastern and Southern Europe to Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, we are seeing more and more schools open up in these different regions. So they're no longer marginal players. They are emerging as meaningful markets in their own right. And this isn't also just about planting schools where there is wealth. It's about where there is movement of people, of ideas, of capital, and of aspiration. Because whether it's Lagos, Seoul, or Sao Paulo, the desire is the same. Education that opens doors, broadens perspectives, and prepares children for a world far more interconnected than the one their parents grew up in. So while the numbers tell us this is a growing market, the map is reminding us that it's also a spreading one, and that distinction does matter. Because where schools are located influences everything, from the curricula they offer, to the staff they attract, to the regulatory frameworks that they must navigate. So from July 2023, we've tracked 468 new international schools that have opened their doors around the world. So just thinking about that, that's almost 500 schools just in the past 2 years. And why? Well, it's much like what I just shared there, because the promise of an international education remains incredibly powerful. Learning in English, setting globally recognized qualifications, accessing English medium higher education, which for many families translates directly into global career opportunity. And as economies strengthen, international schooling has evolved from a luxury for small elite to a priority for a much broader segment of families with the financial means to invest in it. And yes, of course, the wealthiest families still make up a significant share of enrollment, but increasingly demand is being driven by families, both local and expat, who are stretching their budgets to provide this kind of education for their children. And that shift is reshaping the market because affordable no longer means lower quality. It means greater access. New schools are opening across a spectrum of price points, but the greatest momentum is in the mid-market fee bracket. In fact, 82% of the schools founded since July 2023 fall into this category. And look at where they're opening on the slide here. 72% of these new schools are in Asia, with almost a quarter in Western Asia, another quarter in Southeast Asia, and 12% in East Asia. So together, these figures are telling us a clear story that Asia continues to dominate, of course, in the international schools landscape, and it's the mid-market segment that's fueling much of the sector's current growth. So these type of schools may not get the headlines that the premium schools do when they, announce a new school opening, but it is showing us that we're seeing a democratization of access, a widening of who international education is for and where it's taking root. So I thought I'd just, on this next slide, spotlight some markets around the world just to, again, show us how different some of the places may be and how they operate and also the regulatory environment. So we'll kick off with China here, which is still home to over 1,100 international schools, and it remains the largest market by volume. But in recent years, we've seen significant policy shifts, restrictions on foreign curricula, ownership, and it's prompted consolidation and also repositioning of schools. And then actually, in some cases, we've seen closures. And yet demand persists. The appetite for bilingual and globally relevant education among local families has not disappeared. It's simply found new pathways. And then over to the United Arab Emirates, in many ways, you can say the UAE has kind of set the benchmark for international school ecosystems, transparent regulation, openness to foreign investment, and a highly professionalized competitive market. Dubai alone hosts over 200 international schools, and the UAE as a whole generates around $7.7 billion in annual tuition fee income, with an average tuition fee close to $9,500 per student. But what's shifting now is less about the quantity of schools and more about the quality and differentiation, through well-being, innovation, personalized pathways to higher education. So the market there is maturing, and with maturity is coming sophistication. Then we staying in the Gulf, we've got Saudi Arabia, which is one of the fastest growing education markets worldwide. The international schools there now generate roughly $2.7 billion in annual tuition fee income, with an average tuition fee of around $8,400. And under the Vision 2030, the government is driving large-scale investment in private education. They're looking to attract global brands and also support bilingual education that reflects Saudi culture while meeting international standards. So demand is powered by a growing professional middle class and Saudi families who value English medium schooling. Now, going to Africa, we've got Kenya there, a standout example from sub-Saharan Africa. Demand here is being fueled by, again, a growing middle class, urban expansion, and also foreign investment, particularly in Nairobi. But parents are looking for stability and academic rigor, often in response to concerns about the rollout of competency-based curriculum within the public education system. So international schools in Kenya enjoy, notable operational autonomy, making the market attractive for investors and groups. But one of the key challenges that's coming up for them is around staffing. There's been a new policy that's requiring a 70-30 ratio of local to expat teachers, which will push schools to rethink recruitment and professional development pipelines. So Kenya in many ways captures both the opportunity and the complexity of Africa's evolving education landscape. Then going to Brazil, it stands out for its scale and resilience. The country's international schools generate around $2.2 billion in annual tuition fee income, with average tuition of around $12,500 per student. There's growth is concentrated, in Sao Paulo and Brasilia, driven by a rising affluence and international business presence. And the market is diversifying too, with more locally owned schools blending international pedagogy with the national curriculum. And finally, looking at Singapore there, it collectively brings in $2.2 billion in annual tuition fee income, similar to what Brazil's being able to generate. But that average annual tuition fee of $19,800 is among the highest in the world. Now, despite limited land and tight licensing, Singapore remains a premium-driven market, focused on innovation, academic excellence, and pathways to global universities. And it continues to serve as a regional education hub here in Southeast Asia. And that's what makes the international schools market so compelling. It's not a monolith. It's a mosaic shaped by regulation, ambition, innovation, and the lived realities of families all over the world. So when we ask why the international school sector is growing so significantly, the answer isn't just one single factor. It's the convergence of global and local forces, be it economic, cultural, and aspirational. Now, first, let's retire that myth that international schools are just for foreigners. In many markets today, 60 to 80% of students are local, and the word international has become less about geography and more about identity, a symbol of modernity, English fluency, and social prestige. These are ambitious, often affluent local families seeking global credentials and English medium education for their children. But what they're really investing in is upward mobility, global opportunity, and to a certain degree, social capital as well. And they're not choosing between the IB or A levels, they're choosing between futures. This is the story of the rising middle class in emerging economies, cities like Jakarta, Mumbai, and Cairo, where families now have the aspiration and the means to make these choices. In behavioral economics, there's a concept called future orientation bias, the belief that investing today, sometimes irrationally, is worthwhile because tomorrow will be better. And to a certain degree, we're seeing that here, where parents aren't just buying schooling, they're buying a hedge against uncertainty, a belief that this form of education can future-proof their child's prospects in an unpredictable world. Add to that a combination of supportive government policies, the pull of English language proficiency, and innovations in teaching and learning, and well, you've got the perfect storm of demand. So as the sector's grown and diversified, one question has become increasingly important. How do we define quality in a global education landscape? Because the truth is, growth alone doesn't guarantee excellence, but for families, investors, and regulators alike, the credibility of an international school depends on more than just curriculum or reputation. It depends on recognized assurance of quality. And that's where accreditation bodies play a vital role. They've become anchors of trust in the market that's expanding faster and in more directions than ever before. So of the 15,000 schools that we're tracking, accreditation actually still represents a relatively small proportion of the international schools market. Because for many high-quality international schools, particularly those in countries without national inspection frameworks, accreditation plays a crucial role. It helps schools raise their standards, sets them apart from competitors, and provides an independent quality mark that appeals to both families and educators. In recruitment, that external validation can make all the difference. Teachers and leaders often gravitate towards accredited schools because they associate them with stability, professional growth, and accountability. But the reality is, if your school is accredited, you're in the minority, because that's 20% that we recognize on our database that have official full accreditation from one of the independent accreditation bodies, so like NIASC and CIS. This number does not include government regulatory frameworks or inspection agencies, which operate under a different remit. And that distinction does matter because it highlights the voluntary nature of this process. Schools choosing to pursue external validation as a commitment to improvement and accountability, which does raise a question for all of us, schools, associations, and accrediting bodies alike, does more need to be done to make accreditation accessible to a broader range of schools, particularly those with smaller budgets or those operating in emerging markets where tuition fees are lower and resources are tighter, or perhaps the importance of independent accreditation is not actually fully appreciated by the school leaders within those schools. Because as the market expands, the challenge isn't only about ensuring growth, it's about ensuring that quality is keeping pace with it. And now, we touched on how there's only 20% of international schools that are fully accredited. Well, over the past 5 years, accreditation within the sector has experienced steady and sustained growth, around 33% increase since 2020. And this growth isn't just a matter of numbers, it's a reflection of shifting priorities within the sector. So as the market matures, more schools are recognizing that accreditation provides more than external validation, delivers a framework of improvement, a community of practice, and shared language of quality that transcends borders. And the few things driving this, we've got the competition for trust. In markets where parents have dozens of international schools to choose from, accreditation is becoming a differentiator, a shorthand for rigor, transparency, and standards that families can rely on. And also, you have the influence of national regulators. In some countries, authorities are actively encouraging or even recognizing international accreditation as a parallel quality assurance mechanism, particularly in systems where national inspections are not designed for international curricula. So this growth in accreditation signals something important. It's not just about schools seeking a badge, it's about the sector raising its collective bar. Now, we just touched on regulations there, and alongside that independent accreditation, government regulation plays a major role in shaping how international schools operate and the experiences that they can offer. But the landscape is far from uniform. In some countries, international schools are tightly regulated, subject to local teacher licensing, language requirements, and curriculum approvals. In others, regulation is just a light touch, focusing mainly on the health, safety, and governance of the school. And for school, this variation creates challenges and opportunities. The key takeaway is that regulation defines autonomy. It determines how international school can truly be in its curriculum, its staffing, its governance, and the cultural space that it occupies. And that in turn shapes how schools pursue accreditation, how families perceive value and how investors plan for a sustainable growth. So one of the most significant global shifts that we're seeing is how governments are redefining the relationship between international and national education. In many countries, international schools are no longer viewed as separate systems. They're being recognized and regulated as part of the wider national education strategy. And this is most visible in these three areas that are listed here. On curriculum, governments are increasingly requiring international schools to include elements of the national framework, being, and which are really tied to identity, being language, culture, civics, and even religion in certain countries. It's a broader push to ensure that students graduating from international schools remain rooted in national values while gaining those global competencies. And on staffing as well, a parallel trend is taking shape. Many governments are introducing localization policies, setting targets or incentives for schools to employ a greater share of national teachers and leaders within their schools. And the motivation behind these policies is not purely regulatory, it's also developmental. By encouraging international schools to hire and train local educators, governments are aiming to build national teaching capacity, transferring skills from international to local staff. They're creating employment opportunities in the private education sector for their people, and also to retain talent, ensuring that educational expertise benefits the local economy, not just expatriate communities. And together, these trends show how regulation is evolving just beyond compliance. Because governments aren't just managing the international school sector, they're using it as a lever for national development, workforce growth, and educational reform. And for schools, that means the regulatory conversation is no longer just about what you teach, it's about who teaches it and how your school contributes to the broader ecosystem that you're operating in. And we've got a couple examples here from some countries about how things have been approached in terms of regulatory lens. So Thailand here, to start off from there, it runs a clear but firm regime. International schools must be licensed by the MOE, and Thai nationals must study Thai language and culture for a fixed amount of time every single week. Foreigners are also required to, but only until a certain level and at much less time as well. But once licensed, schools have room to design curriculum and staffing within those guardrails, which is why the sector feels quite stable and predictable within Thailand. Whereas in Saudi Arabia, it's actually quite a young ministry that's in there that's now just trying to find their way around the international education. But they have, after the ETEC announced a more structured licensing and compliance model for international and private schools, and that sits under the Ministry of Education. And it's all linked to the country's Vision 2030 agenda. Rules cover approval for foreign curricula and quality standards. And also they have the Saudiization policy, which is all about getting national participation in teaching and leadership across private schools. So this is in effect shaping recruitment, PD pipelines and succession planning within international schools in Saudi Arabia. In Qatar, international schools operate with strong government support and clear expectations. Arabic, Islamic studies and Qatar history are compulsory across private schools with defined exception pathways for certain students. But oversight aims to protect national identity while allowing diverse international curricula. And then to Egypt, not too far away from Qatar, it licenses international school again through the MOE, and as well as Qatar requires Arabic, religion and national history for Egyptian students. But authorities have also tightened oversight of tuition and curriculum in recent years, particularly on tuition because of the depreciation of the Egyptian pound. The curricula offered by private international schools must also receive formal approval via the national bodies. And then finally, to South Africa, which has a bit of more of a light touch approach. Independent international schools register with provincial authorities and can offer international curricula such as Cambridge, IB, or even hybrid programs, provided they meet national learning and assessment standards. And then also employment and equity compliance is taken very seriously there, with sector targets phased in under the updated employment equity regulation that's been released. So autonomy coexists with workforce transformation obligations. So together, these examples can highlight the diversity of approaches by governments. And the through line here is simple. Regulation defines autonomy. So from what must be taught to who teaches it, and that mix ultimately shapes each market's risks, recruitment, and room to innovate. Now, we just, if regulation is defining how schools are operating, curriculum defines what schools stand for. And the choice of curriculum is one of the most strategic decisions that a school can make. It shapes identity, staffing, and the pathways that students take beyond graduation. So the British, American, and IB programs remain dominant in the sector, but the landscape is diversifying. We're seeing regional frameworks, bilingual routes, and hybrid models that blend national and international standards. So curriculum is no longer just an academic framework. It's a statement of values. It signals what a school believes in, be it global mobility, academic rigor, language, or even holistic growth. So in the next few slides, we'll look at which curricula are leading the market, how they've evolved, and what these choices reveal about the future of international education. And we'll kick off with the top 5 here, and these are the most prevalent curricula worldwide based on the 15,075 schools on our database. And you can see how the British and American systems continue to lead. And that's really thanks to global recognition and alignment with university admissions. The IB remains very close behind as well, prized for its inquiry-based holistic approach and emphasis on international mindedness. And beneath these global frameworks, a quiet revolution is underway. We've got bilingual, hybrid, and school design models that are multiplying. Curriculum is increasingly about connection as much as selection, linking global standards to local culture. Because families want flexibility and credibility. And as a result, schools are blending these different frameworks together, combining the IB with A levels or layering national curricula with international components. And this is to offer multiple routes to success for the children in their care. And in today's market, the question is rarely which curriculum do you offer, but rather which pathways can you open? And over the past 5 years, curriculum change has been defined less by upheaval and rather by steady diversification. Again, like we just mentioned in the previous slide, the British and American systems have both expanded in absolute terms. The global footprint is all over the world, and the IB as well is continuing to gain ground across Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, and Europe as schools adopt more inquiry-driven learning. Now, meanwhile, we also have national international programs, such as India's CBSE international program, or even in China, the bilingual models through those schools that are licensed, the bilingual schools. It shows how localization is reshaping global education. These frameworks are retaining national identity while meeting international standards. And growth is strongest from how we've been tracking the growth here in hybrid and bilingual provision, especially in Southeast Asia, Latin America, and the Gulf. Regions where parents want cultural continuity alongside that global opportunity. So the direction is clear. Curricular choice is expanding, but so is the expectation that schools personalize learning to every context. And that takes us to the exit examinations. So at the point of graduation, the picture is actually remaining quite familiar. A-levels and international A-levels remain the most common exit pathway offered by about 16% of schools. And the IB diploma at 15% continues to grow, while the AP sits at around 7%. And these qualifications are trusted bridges to global higher education. But schools are now offering multiple pathways. Many allow students to choose between whether it's the IB or the A levels, or pursue emerging options such as the mastery transcript or other portfolio-based credentials. And the shift mirrors a wider movement, which is redefining what counts as evidence of learning and creating flexible routes that match different learning styles and aspirations within each individual student in a school's care. So the one-size-fits-all exit route is beginning to fade, and the future belongs to multiple adaptable pathways to success. And alongside that, assessment is also evolving alongside curriculum. So the move towards digital assessment is gathering pace, driven by technology, new pedagogy, and post-pandemic digital learning. So this isn't just about putting exams online, although some of the pilots have been doing that. It's more about rethinking how achievement is measured. So Cambridge International, for example, they're actually going to begin offering digital versions of key qualifications from 2026. And by 2023, they aim to have 85% digital delivery. Pearson at Excel, actually in 2023, their on-screen GCSE pilot with King's Inter High proved that large-scale digital exams are feasible. And the IB, actually, they started this ahead of the game. They've been doing the NYP online assessments since 2016, and they're going to extend them to the DP program from 2026 for certain subjects. And the College Board as well has already digitized the SAT, first for international students in 2023, and then in 2024 for US candidates. So yeah, these digital exams allow for adaptive testing, faster feedback, and more inclusive design. But challenges still remain, access, infrastructure, teacher readiness, but also innovation within these exit examinations as well. But the trajectory is really clear. Digital assessment is moving from trial to the norm, and ultimately it reinforces an essential truth. Assessment isn't the end of learning. It's just a part of it. And that moves us on to the student experience, because we talked about curricula, assessments, the systems shaping international education, but education isn't just a framework, it's an experience. So what does it all actually look like in the daily life of a student? And what does it feel like to grow up in an international school in 2025? Because for many students, it means learning in classrooms where multiple languages are spoken, multiple passports are held, and cultural references can shift from one conversation to the next. It means being surrounded by difference and learning to see that not as a barrier, but as a strength. And one of the most significant pedagogical shifts we've seen in recent years is how schools are responding to this diversity, particularly through their approach to language and identity. So English as an additional language, for example, or EAL, is no longer for many schools a bolt-on service offered in a side room. In many international schools that we've been speaking with, it's now a whole school philosophy integrated into curriculum planning, teaching practice, and leadership strategy. And we've also come across a lot of schools that are embracing translanguaging, where students use their full linguistic repertoire to learn and express themselves. So this isn't just a language policy, it's an inclusion strategy, because language is deeply tied to identity and belonging. And when schools make space for that, students don't just succeed academically, they thrive socially and emotionally. They feel seen, safe, empowered to bring all parts of themselves into the learning space. And that's crucial in a world defined by global mobility, cultural hybridity, and heightened awareness of mental health and well-being. Because supporting such diverse student populations isn't easy. It requires time, professional learning, and intentionality, but the rewards are profound. And these young people are growing up fluent in flexibility, comfortable with ambiguity, and capable of connecting across difference in ways few generations before them could. So in many ways, they actually embody the qualities of education systems and what those systems aspire to: adaptability, empathy, and global competence. And that leads us on to student well-being, which is one of the more important aspects of this evolving landscape. And because what we've seen time and time again in our research is that well-being isn't an optional extra, it's a precondition for learning. So I think just to touch on, to give a bit more context on what's happening in the classroom, we mentioned about the student experience and touched on the diversity within the classroom. And, the picture has changed today compared to what international schools were like decades ago when they first emerged. Because in many markets, local families now make up the majority of enrollments. And that shift has profound implications for student well-being and inclusion. Local students often enter with different cultural expectations, home languages, and aspirations. So for them, the international school is not just a place for learning, it's a space where identity is negotiated on a daily basis. And this is where well-being takes a center stage. Schools are learning that supporting well-being isn't only about counseling or mental health, it's about creating a sense of belonging in increasingly diverse classrooms. So the growth of bilingual mid-market schools reflects this balance. Since 2015, bilingual provision has grown by 18%, now representing 36% of the global international schools market. So families don't want to choose between global access and cultural continuity. They want both. In Japan, for example, 43% of international schools now offer bilingual programs, helping students maintain their linguistic and cultural roots while gaining access to global opportunities. And countries such as Saudi, Spain, and Egypt are seeing the same pattern, rise in local enrollment driven by parents who value both the international standards, but also local identity. So for schools, it's creating both a challenge and an opportunity to ensure that well-being isn't just about individual care, but about community coherence, where students from many backgrounds all feel equally seen, valued, and connected. Because in today's international schools, diversity is the constant, and the schools that thrive are those that make belonging their competitive advantage. There we go. And in several markets, well-being is actually no longer just a school-level choice. It's actually becoming a policy requirement. It's going back to regulation, because governments are embedding well-being expectations into national education frameworks. And that's reshaping how international schools structure their time, resources, and priorities. So in China, for example, the Ministry of Education has placed a renewed emphasis on physical education and student well-being. A new national policy requires public schools to provide at least 2 hours of physical activity each day, both during and outside regular lessons. So while it's directed primarily at the state schools, the shift is influencing international schools too. Many are rethinking curriculum balance, scheduling, and assessment to ensure that physical, emotional, and academic well-being are given equal weight. And we're also seeing 3 clear pedagogical responses emerging. A move towards greater personalization and flexibility in learning, a deeper integration of bilingualism and multilingualism, and a stronger focus on student agency and engagement. And shifting over to the Emirates there, it's been elevated to a regulatory priority. So in the last academic year, ADEC, the Abu Dhabi private regulator, introduced 39 updated policies for private schools and 27 new policies for early education institutions. 14 of these were directly addressed at health, safety, and well-being. So this demonstrates how well-being has moved from rhetoric to regulation. Schools are now expected to show tangible provision, structured well-being programs, staff training, and policies that ensure students thrive both academically and personally. And in the UK, inclusive education practices such as the Universal Design for Learning are becoming central to school improvement frameworks. This model encourages schools to build flexibility and accessibility into teaching methods, curriculum design, and classroom environments, ensuring supportive tools benefit all learners, not only those with identified needs. And many international schools aligned with UK practice are also adopting reduced screen time initiatives and phone-free policies, recognizing that digital balance is now part of student well-being. So taken together, these examples signal an important evolution, that well-being is becoming systemized. It's no longer just about having a counselor or a yoga session, it's about creating national accountability for the conditions that help students flourish. And as well-being becomes more prominent in inspection frameworks and national policies, schools are recognizing that genuine impact only happens when it's embedded at every level, not just in counseling or pastoral care, but across the entire school culture. And this is what we mean by a whole school approach to well-being. So it's not a program or theme week, it's a shared mindset that connects leadership, teaching, and daily routines. And so our research kind of picked out some key characteristics here. That well-being should be strategically led, Leadership should set the tone, weaving well-being into schools' mission, development plans, and staff evaluation. So it's seen as part of educational quality and not an add-on. Also that it's community-wide, that it includes everyone, be it the students, staff, and families. And third, that it's proactive, that schools use data and dialogue from student surveys to attendance patterns to spot early signs of stress and act before problems can escalate. And as one school leader told us in our interviews, that leadership buy-in to well-being is at least as important as the academic results that it produces. Because when well-being is truly whole school, it's not a policy, it's the air people breathe every single day. But how about from a resource perspective? How can it succeed to be a whole school approach? Well, our research identified several key resources that consistently make the difference. So professional learning, equipping teachers and leaders to understand the link between well-being, cognition, and classroom climate so it becomes part of daily practice. Time and space, having advisory sessions, mentoring, and opportunities for play and reflection. Well-being can't thrive in a timetable that's always full. Leadership commitment, like I mentioned previously, being so the leadership is visible, the consistent support, and often through a designated well-being lead or steering group that tracks progress and accountability. Data and evidence, using surveys and feedback tools to measure well-being systematically, moving from anecdotal evidence to actionable insights. Community partnerships, so engaging with parents and the wider community to build shared understanding and reinforce well-being beyond the school gate. So when these resources align, training, time, leadership, data, and community, well-being becomes more than a department, it becomes a defining feature of the school culture. And the results are clear: stronger relationships, higher engagement, and improved learning outcomes. And as we look ahead, these same principles of leadership, collaboration, and adaptability will continue to define the future of international education, not just in well-being, but in how schools evolve to meet new challenges. And that brings us to this final section on future development, because the sector is, going through a different phase now, one that's defined not only by care and culture, but by growth, scale, and strategy. Because we're seeing schools evolve from sustaining what they built to reimagining their position in an increasingly competitive global market. So we'll explore some different drivers here. First is the rise of the school groups and global independent school brands. The consolidation that we see that's transforming how schools operate and compete with each other. And second, we'll look at the new schools in development worldwide. So the projects, the pipelines shaping where the next phase of international education will emerge. So let's look at the groups and brands first of all, because one of the most powerful shifts in international education today is the rise of school groups and then also these independent school brands. And it isn't just growth, it's transformation. Large groups are changing how schools operate, how families choose, and how competition is playing out. Because today, 38% of international schools belong to a school group. And among those in development, that figure rises to 56%. Proof that the future of this market is increasingly defined by scale. Groups bring capital, shared infrastructure, and brand recognition. They enable professional mobility, shared standards, and cross-campus innovation. But scale does cut both ways. It raises standards, yet it also intensifies competition, especially in mature markets where independents must differentiate against multi-campus brands. So the key question for school leaders becomes, what's your competitive edge when parents can choose between a single school and one of these global brands? And if we look at the top five, we've got Grupo SAB based out of Brazil, Beacon House and the City School based out of Pakistan, and North Anglia Education and International School Partnership based out of the UK. And in ISP in particular, they seem to announce a new school acquisition every other week. Grupo SAB made their way to the top of our school group list after the acquisition of the Maple Bear schools. So for instance, it gave them a global footprint and the #1 position worldwide after that one acquisition. Proof of how consolidation is redrawing this educational map. And at the same time, we're seeing a surge in the independent school brands expanding internationally, exploring not just their curricula, but their heritage and reputation. And actually, India has become one of the focal points. We've seen Harrow International Bengaluru open up, Wellington College in Pune, Shrewsbury, Mumbai, Charterhouse is going into Goa, and also Bedford in Mohali. And actually, Bedford School is going to be the first British branded girls' school in India. And they're all part of this wave of independent school brands expanding overseas. So for these institutions, internationalization is about reach and resilience. They're looking to diversify income while extending their legacies. And on our database, we now have 178 British branded international schools worldwide. That's up 314% in just a decade. That's nearly 7 times faster than the overall sector growth. And I'm sure you've been following news, so you'll understand some of the reasons as to why we've seen that massive expansion of British schools overseas in recent times. But whether through consolidation or brand expansion, the global education landscape is increasingly shaped by networks of influence, groups and schools with both reach and vision. So where are schools opening up in the next couple of years? Well, we're currently tracking 289 new international schools. So these are either planned, under construction, or preparing to open very soon. And Asia, once again, continues to lead with 208 schools in the pipeline. And within Asia, Western Asia in particular, being the Gulf, dominates with 70 new schools being planned to open. Half of those are in the Emirates. Even in one of the most saturated markets, that expansion signals enduring confidence in private education there. Southeast Asia is also buzzing with activity. Vietnam has 12 schools that are planned. Thailand has 14. Malaysia also has 14 new schools. So you can see Southeast Asia remains a magnet for both regional and global investors. And even in China, despite tighter regulation, around 12 future schools are in progress. So it's proof that investor appetite remains strong, even in such a tight regulatory environment. And what's fueling this growth? Well, it's not just the demographics, but rising family mobility, the perception of education as the best route to opportunity, greater for affordability as well across different price points, and strategic investment from both public and private sectors. Yet, this growth is not guaranteed. Sustained progress will depend on schools' ability to adapt, in their fee models to stay accessible, in curriculum design to stay relevant, in teacher recruitment to maintain that quality, and in differentiation to stand apart from national private schools. So the next phase of expansion won't just be about where schools open, it will be about how they evolve. So we got 5 key takeaways from the session today as we wrap up. And we'll just go through these one by one. So, I mean, the first one, growth in accreditation. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, accreditation continues to expand, giving schools recognized framework for quality and accountability. As independent regulation varies globally, accreditation is becoming the clearest marker of credibility for families, staff, and investors alike. We also have a global emphasis on local identity. Around the world, governments are requiring international schools to integrate local language, culture, and civics subjects. And this marks a shift from being international in isolation to being globally connected and locally grounded. So an essential balance for long-term relevance. The third point, strategic focus on higher education pathways. Schools continue to prioritize curriculum and examinations that open university doors worldwide, whether through British, American, or IB systems. The goal remains consistent: to prepare students for global opportunity while ensuring flexibility and choice. Fourth one, well-being as infrastructure. So well-being has moved from an initiative to an expectation, embedded in policy, inspection, and school culture. Most successful schools now view well-being as the foundation of performance, community, and resilience. And the fifth and last one there, the rise of groups and brands. Scale is reshaping this sector. School groups and established education brands are expanding across continents, driving professionalization, investment, and competition. So their influence will continue to define the next phase of growth in this sector. So together, these five trends, show a sector that is maturing, diversifying, and aligning with broader social and economic priorities. So the international schools market has always evolved quickly, but today that evolution feels more intentional than ever, grounded in quality, enriched by culture, and guided by well-being and innovation. So thank you once again, Nias, for hosting this discussion, and to all of you for joining. I think what we'll do is we'll open up for a bit of Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much, Sammy. That was such an insightful analysis of the data that ISC has collected, and I'm sure that everybody's gained a lot of different perspective from that. We'll go ahead and begin with the Q&A that were dropped into the chat. So the first one that was asked, Sammy, is there data on the size and scale of new schools opening? Do you collect any data on the average starting point of enrollments?
Yes, yeah. So like I showed in the slide there about the future schools in development. So we'll be tracking. So once they've opened, that's when we'll get in touch to find out, the opening enrollments. And it's also, yeah, it's also demonstrates as well, how saturated certain markets may be. I mean, there are a lot of nuances again to opening a new school. Again, like I mentioned about the curricula that you're offering, the staff that you're recruiting, the regulatory environment that you're in. Because for example, there's in a particular country, we're aware of the struggle that a school have had to get the approval to take in foreign students in their opening semester. So of course that's hindered their ability to grow, in particular, their enrollment targets that they had in place. But that's an external force that's limiting them. So yes, we do track quite a bit of that. Yeah, to see the scale of these different campus launches, as well as the investment, the capex that's been put into these different campus developments. Because I think another thing about the more so at that premium end of the market is having, facilities. It seems like every single year, okay, one school one year will open an Olympic-sized swimming pool that sets the new standard. All of the new schools will either be doing exactly the same or trying to level up on that by having two Olympic-sized swimming pools. So it seems to be that game that, yeah, just that constant yardstick to be the one offering the best services to their families.
Yeah, certainly. And you really articulated the competitive nature, as there's a large group expansion in the international space. Another question that has come up, and it's perhaps not well articulated as it should be, but what extent are schools dealing with artificial intelligence? Is ISC collecting any information
Yeah.
on how schools view that as a emerging impact? And we'd be keen to hear insights on that.
Yeah, actually, we usually present on AI, but I felt like it's been done to death in a lot of different sessions. So I apologize that I didn't include it in my presentation today, but I can share, yeah, some insights of what we've been finding. So it yeah, there seems to be a scale of the adoption of AI across different schools. We'll have some that we're interviewing where they've gone all in on adoption. They're very open to that innovation, and also with that uncertainty of, you know, understanding how powerful this new technology is. Because I think in every other week we're seeing a new tool be released. But ultimately, schools are just looking at how is it impacting the learning outcomes, and also that day-to-day learning in the classroom as well. Is our teachers ready to deploy it? And I think another point that leaders always mention is that the kids are already way ahead of the teachers that are trying to teach them how to use these tools. So that's also a reality that we come across. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, we found a lot of schools being very reserved and actually limiting the use or even not allowing the use of AI tools in the classroom. And it's used more so in the administrative side to begin with. Again, they're just trying to find their feet with it, see where things are moving with AI. So yeah, we've seen a real spectrum of how school leaders are adopting artificial intelligence tools in the classroom. But I would say that more so it's in the administrative side, with your operational teams, but also in the planning. So for teachers using it for the lesson planning, we've seen it more so being used in that side of things rather than actually in the classroom with students. That's still something that hasn't been widespread from the interviews that we've been doing with school leaders. So I think it's still an evolving landscape, and yeah, always finding school leaders share with us that they're just not really sure right now. I think it's still a really big unknown, but I think it's understood as well that it's not going anywhere. It's become part of the fabric of society now, And it's about time that education kind of catches up and embraces it. I think that's a sentiment that is shared across a lot of the leaders that we speak with. But it's just about how to introduce that into the classroom. People want to be very deliberate and careful about introducing it into the classroom.
Yeah, those are all key reflections. Thank you for articulating that. Another participant has asked,
Yes.
the extent that ISC correlates trends in demographic populations and international school openings. So we know that in certain regions of the world, we're actually seeing a lower birth rate and potential population decline. What kind of correlation work do you do with those types of statistics?
Yeah, I mean it's fascinating with, when I look at the Gulf, there's, for example, we've seen a drop in early years enrollment. I think it was in Kuwait where we were examining that. And of course, that's had an impact on, well, schools have had capacity in the early years classes, but they've had to reduce that and reallocate those classrooms for another purpose, for maybe the higher grades or so on. So yes, it is having an impact in different parts of the world. I think as well because when we talk about international schools, we're talking about private education. And so they are serving a population that has the means, has that disposable income. So not as much of an impact as we would have first imagined. I think especially when I think about places like South Korea, Japan with very low fertility rates. But there's still healthy demand within these schools at the lower end of the school. And that's purely just because, again, it's a private sector. And so the supply is limited that's available for these international school spaces. So I think at the moment there's within those certain countries that have those very low fertility rates. I mean, even here in Thailand, I'm in a country where it's got a low fertility rate as well. But I think the impacts will probably be in the next, I'd say, decade or 2 decades away. I think it's seeing that generation of kids come through school, and it's a following generation that perhaps will see more of a bigger impact once we see that kind of phase of population move through. So I think more so it'd be in the public sector that's probably having a bigger impact. But in the private sector, because it is a smaller population that we're dealing with compared to the wider education sector. But yeah, in parts of the world, it is having an impact. But like I said, that wider impact across the whole sector is not yet being impacted with that declining fertility rates.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think we'll take a final question from the chat where we are in our time in the day. What does the data tell us about international school graduate destinations? Are
Mm.
students still going to university, college, or are they choosing other destinations such as straight into employment?
Interesting one there. I think, yeah, depends what part of the market is what we're talking about. If we're talking at that premium end, the high fee charging schools, we're still looking at those typical destinations. The US, UK, Canada, Australia. I think that they're still favored by families. But actually, this academic year, we've seen it more where the sentiment is less in favor of the US. And so those families are considering perhaps Europe as an alternative, looking at Germany, the Netherlands. So the US's status as being the top destination, we are seeing a bit of an impact from school leaders. They are saying that, yeah, there is a little bit of sentiment amongst families that maybe it's not the best place to go at this moment in time. Um, but if we go into that kind of mid-market segment, well, regional options are a lot more popular. So if we talk about the Gulf or in Southeast Asia, a lot of universities over in these parts of the world are actually growing in enrollments. And also it's because we have these international satellite campuses for universities over in the West, so whether in the UK or the US. And so those options are now being taken up by families. So I think it's about being closer to home as well. That's a reason for some of these families, and also affordability. It's a lot cheaper to have them stay within the same region or even in their home country to go to these different universities. And also we see the quality of universities, say in Qatar or in Japan, or I mean Japan's got great universities, but let's say for Thailand, for example, the universities are improving in quality and also increasing the courses subjects that they offer. And so those options are then being more attractive for local families to consider as an option instead of investing and sending them overseas. So yeah, I think regional and local options are growing in popularity, and the applications are increasing from families because they're seeing them as alternatives to shipping them overseas to the West. But like I said, still at that kind of top end of the market, still the typical destinations are still favored by those families.
Thank you. And I think we'll just field maybe two very brief questions. One
Yeah, no
is,
worries. Yeah.
have you looked at data and trends in terms of the teacher shortage situation in more mature economies like the United States or Europe? And what impact has teacher quality and shortage had on the international space?
Yeah, again, I apologize. I didn't include the teacher movement piece of our presentation. So it looks like I need to do another presentation for you guys with all the other data points that we
Anytime,
have.
Sammy. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, in terms of yeah, in short, the number of quality teachers in the sector is in decline. It's becoming more and more challenging for school leaders to recruit the teachers that they're looking for, particularly in maths, science, those kind of specialist subjects. So we are seeing a shortage in that side, and also for destinations that are not on the top of the list for teachers to go to. So let's say, yeah, for example, like Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan, or even some of the Gulf states as well, are not the top of the list for a lot of international teachers. And so they're the ones really struggling to bring applicants over. Now, in terms of the applications that schools receive, that still is going up, but it's the quality of the resumes that they're receiving. So although those numbers may be going up, no, sorry, but the talent pool in terms of that quality is reducing. So it's a very challenging environment out there, and we're seeing some initiatives come out in different countries. So I think, like in India, for example, I think it was Cambridge launched a training program for local teachers again to level up and upskill them, try and fill that place. And then I think I've seen it in Vietnam as well. I think Cambridge as well was training teachers there. Again, just to stem that difficulty for schools that they're not able to get the teachers that they're looking for. So I think we're seeing these initiatives pop up around the world to upskill and level up the local teaching workforce, so there's a good alternative that they can bring them in and replace those foreign teachers that used to come in. I mean, we're also seeing as well schools look to markets that they didn't traditionally look at. I think South Africans as well. We've seen a big increase of South African teachers across the sector. So being accepted as a viable alternative, that's been a big one. Yeah, so it's a systemic problem that unfortunately just not seeing as many people come into the sector that with the quality to deliver in the classroom. So yeah, I can do another presentation for you guys if you need touching on
Definitely.
our
Well,
curricula.
again, we'd be thrilled to have you back anytime, Sammy. And I think just to bring closure to this, if I were an individual or a school and I wanted to subscribe to ISC Research, what benefits would I get? We've had a couple participants ask, would they get access to some data sets for their
Mm.
individual use and exploration, and maybe just sell what benefits that an individual or school might get joining
Yeah.
your organization.
Yeah. So if you take part in the research, so I look after the field research team. So if we invite you for an interview, what you would receive back from us is we give you a full report on what's happening in your country. If we don't have the report on your country, then we'll give you a regional version so that you can see what's happening within, whether it's your sub-region, so be Southeast Asia, or it's the region, so that would be for Africa. So we always intend to give back to the schools that take part. So that'll give you some quantitative data points as well as the intelligence that we're gathering on the ground. So we cover key areas such as the demand and supply dynamics that's happening within the market, as well as what's happening with teaching and learning across different schools, educational technology, and so on and so forth. So, and regulation as well. So we give that back to anybody who participates in the research that we do.
Fantastic. Well, Sammy, on behalf of, NEASC and the Commission on International Education and all participants, I'm sure, thank you so much for this very insightful presentation. And we do look forward to speaking and hosting you again in the future.
All right. Thank you very much. And thanks to everybody who joined today.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.